Russian history with Dr. Brovkin. Also, this is for AP European history with Dr. Brovkin. Today's conversation is about the era of great reforms, or the reign of Alexander II, which is from 1855 to his death. He was murdered by terrorists in 1880. So this is probably one of the most important. Next to Peter and Catherine, this is the greatest, perhaps even greater than they are, and you will see why, because he totally modernized Russia and introduced very bold, courageous, and reforms that profoundly changed the country, and also because he's been killed. He's been killed by a terrorist. He's a kind of a saintly figure because he put his life on the line to change Russia, and in the end, he was murdered. So very briefly, to bridge the two eras, we finished at Catherine II, which is 1790s, and then we fast forward 60 years into 1855. So what happened in this time is basically known in Russian history as First Napoleonic Wars, which is great story of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, storming of Moscow, and Napoleon in Moscow, burning Moscow. All of that is very dramatic, but it really did not impact the development of Russia that much, except the glory of defeating Napoleon's uh, armies in Russia, not on the battlefield, but because of the supply and communications and the Russian winter and Napoleon's poor planning of his campaign, etc., etc. It didn't really leave much of a mark on Russian history, except perhaps the presence of Russian officers in Paris, and for about 2 years they were in Western Europe, from the Battle of Leipzig to the March on Paris. That did play a role, because when they came back to Russia, they had all kinds of ideas of liberty and fraternity that they tried to implement in the uprising that's known as Decembrists, which they tried to convince Nicholas I, who came right after the death of Alexander I, to introduce constitutional reforms. He refused. He suppressed the uprising. 6 people were hanged, others exiled to Siberia, and that is the period which is known as the wasted 30 years. So the reign of Nicholas I from 1825 to 1855 is when all of Europe is like forging forward, especially England, with industrialization, industrial revolution, railroad construction. The champion is England, but close behind is Belgium and France, and the beginning of industrialization in Germany. Russia stands still. Nothing is happening. No railroads are built, nothing. The serfs are treated as almost as slaves. Almost, I say, because in 1808 they finally banned selling serfs in the marketplace. But it was a pretty bad time and pretty wasteful years for Russia and for its development. And so this is the background when a new Tsar comes in, and his name is Alexander II. And as I said, he probably is the greatest of them all in terms of what he managed to accomplish. So I'm going to look at his reforms one by one, and then at society and opposition to his reforms, which are the terrorists who finally killed him. So the most important, of course, reform is the abolition of serfdom, 1861. So that's the greatest reform of all that pretty much changed Russia beyond recognition. Now, what does it actually mean, abolition of serfdom? To understand that, we have to understand what serfdom is. Serfdom basically means that peasants are fixed to the land. That's very important to understand, not to the person of the landlord. No, they are fixed means they cannot leave. They have to live there. It used to be in the Middle Ages that they could leave. Now they cannot leave. Now, in theory, the landlord doesn't really own the peasants. He owns the land, but the peasants have to live there. They're fixed to the land. And therefore, since they are fixed to the land, they cannot leave. They live on that land, and they pay dues to the landlord because he owns the land. And the dues are what the landlords live off. I mean, that's their profit. This is their source of income. This is why Catherine II was appalled when they wanted more and more control over peasants and harder exploitation, that she thought democracy in Russia would lead to even worse serfdom if you allow them to have what they want, as it was in the southern United States, that slavery was pretty much in the most horrible forms. So anyway, when he assembled the commission to prepare the reform, they started thinking about what can we do? How can we square the circle? How can we liberate the serfs without destroying the landlords? Because they are the ruling class. They are the educated class. I mean, you cannot just say, okay, you don't own anything anymore. How do you do that? This is a fundamental question that they discovered in their research. Well, there were many interesting projects and things, to do this and that, and to consider peasants free, but not the land. Finally, they found a very, very interesting and pretty much a good solution. So here are the conditions of the liberation. Number one, as of 18th of February, 1861, Russian serfs are declared free citizens. Their person is free. They are no longer serfs, which means they can get a passport, they can leave, they can employ themselves, they can sue somebody in the court. They get legal equality. That in itself, by the way, is a revolution. This is comparable to the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France. Basically, peasants become equal to everybody else, including their landlords. They can sue in the courts. They require citizenship. So this is an incredible breakthrough. But not only that, Alexander considered what is their relationship to the land. One of the proposals was the Prussian idea. The Prussian idea is that the landlord owns all the land, and the peasants are free, and then they have to pay the landlord if they are on his land. He rejected that idea. Alexander said, no, peasants have to have the land of their own. And so the land was divided into two parts. One was called the communal land, that belonged to the peasant community as such. The word commune is actually used in France when you talk about local villages, la commune. So the communal land, and then there's a landlord's land. He actually owns it as private property. And the peasants only pay to him if they rent his land. And then there was a program for 50 years to mortgage the land that the landlord has, so that at the end of the 50 years, peasants will actually buy it off. So it's like in America, you buy a house, you get a mortgage for 30 years. At the end of 30 years, you finish payment of mortgage payments, and then you own the house. But that was the same kind of system. The landlords the peasants got outright their own land, the communal land. On top of it, they got payments for 50 years for landlord's land if they had those. And then at the end, they would own the land. That was the idea. So it was a fairly fair idea. And it worked. But I will talk about the influence and impact of these reforms later. Right now, let me move on to the next one. In other words, it is a successful reform that basically created a new class of citizens who were landowners and peasants. But the important thing for the future is that the land was owned by the community rather than individually. And that actually created a huge increase of population in Russia, because the community redivided communal land every 20 years. And if you had 2 sons, you get more land. If you had 4 sons, you get more land. So there was an incentive for peasants to have more sons, so that they could get a little bit of a larger share of communal land. So that actually is why from 1860, population of Russia was 60 million. By 1900, it was 120 million. So it's doubled in 40 years because of that system of incentives for peasants to have a larger families. Okay, now we go on to the next reform, which is even more important, perhaps. It's called the judicial reform. So judicial reform is the creation in Russia of the system of the courts of jury, which is totally like Western Europe or like the United States. It was the citizens who would be in the courts of jury and who would decide innocent or guilty. It was also reform of the penal code, almost identical as in France. So it was westernization of Russian legal system. My supervisor at Princeton was a professor who wrote a book which was called Emergence of Legal Consciousness in Russia. And that's exactly about this period where he argued that Russia emerged because of this reform as what everybody wants, a, a country with the rule of law based on a code of laws. A rule of law was established, and a fair system of courts by citizens was established, which is, of course, a great big through. That also means court judges. It also means lawyers. It also means defense lawyers. It means journalists. It means a whole infrastructure of a legal system of a modern European or like United States country. Okay, the next reform was the reform of the army, which was also very important. Up to that point, the old Russian army was based on the recruits who were delivered by villages on a chance basis, and they served in the army for 25 years. But then, as a result, they were free. So if you serve 25 years in the army, you come back a free man, not a serf, and that was the incentive. And then, of course, you could save some money while you're serving. You could even become an officer. You could even become a noble if you are, get an officer's rank in the army thanks to the table of ranks. But if you didn't get anything and came back as a soldier, you would get freedom and some money. So Alexander II changed all this, and he creates a conscript army for 5 years each. So every peasant boy goes to the army for 5 years, and then he comes back. But in fact, it was not even everyone. It was not almost. The rich peasants could pay off and not to go to the army. But in other words, it creates a much bigger army, and the big impact of that reform is that peasant boys would get training in modern weapons and modern ideas and modern everything by spending 5 years with the army. So they would be kind of pulled out of their traditional villages. They would see nothing but their villages. Then they would be pulled out and kind of modernized in a sense. And when they come back, they would be already people who had experienced the army. Okay, so that's the next important reform. The next one would be general economic modernization. There was sponsorship of industry, and first Russian railroads began to build. And Russia is a big country. So like a railroad from St. Petersburg to Moscow is 600 kilometers, which is pretty big. It's almost like from Paris to the south of France. So they are beginning to build railroads, and because of the distances, these are quite serious projects with railroads beginning to cross European Russia from Petersburg to Moscow and then to Kiev and to the Kharkov and the Black Sea. So they do actually reach the Black Sea coast, which is tremendously important because one of the reasons Russia lost the Crimean War was because there was no railroad to supply the troops in Crimea against the French and the British who attacked Russia in her own territory in Crimea. It was aggression of the French and the British. Anyway, railroad construction boom is what's happening in the 60s and 70s, and that is a huge economic development sponsored by the policies of Alexander II. Now, finally, one of his greatest achievements is a war with Ottoman Empire. And that is the war that's called the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. It's a huge topic in its own right. There are books and books written about it, but very briefly, it was a war that Alexander himself was there. He was with the troops. He felt it's his duty to be with his troops in the trenches. And this was a war of liberation. When I was in Sofia just at New Year's Eve. I was surprised that there were monuments to Russian generals all over the place. And the biggest monument of all was to the Tsar Liberator. And one of the biggest avenues there is to the Russian Tsar Liberator. In other words, because of this war, Bulgaria and Romania got their independence from Ottoman Empire. And then there was a very interesting moment when Russian army was approaching Constantinople, and one of the officers wanted to proceed and take Constantinople, which would be realization of ancient Russian dream of conquest of Constantinople, the third Rome. But then Alexander ordered to stop, and they didn't. And then there were peace negotiations that didn't go very well for Russia. But in any case, it is an important war in a sense of strengthening Russian prestige, beating the Turks in the Black Sea, and if not taking Constantinople, then at least to create two independent states, which Russia hoped would be friendly to Russia, particularly Bulgaria, Romania. It turned out to be that the only really real friend Russia acquired was Serbia, that would play a big role later on in World War I. So Russian-Turkish War is a big boost to prestige of Russia in Europe. It really scared the Austrians and the Germans of Russian preponderance. It was one of the reasons that the alliance with Austria and Germany collapsed. And then 4 years later, after the death of Alexander II, Russian-French alliance was concluded. But this is a separate story. Okay, now I'd like to focus a little bit about the society and the resistance to his reforms that came out a totally unexpected quarter. One would have expected resistance to come from the nobles because they are the losers in the reforms. The winners were the peasants. But resistance comes from a totally unexpected quarter, and these are young people. And there's a great Russian novel that is called Fathers and Sons, and that discusses this kind of a conflict between the new generation. These are the people who are rebels against their parents. These are young people who are a lot of them are from noble families, and they detest the serfdom. They detest abuse of Russian peasants. They become almost like worshipping the great Russian narod, the people, and have this guilty feeling about the abuse that the peasants had gone through at the hands of their parents. So it's a very interesting psychological phenomenon. These are very honest, very idealistic, very dedicated people, and they begin a new movement, which is called Movement to the People. And that means that they decide to go to the countryside and serve the people. It would be like if you guys in Morocco went to the High Atlas and decided, instead of going to the United States making money, if you decided to go and serve your people and go to the villages that have no electricity and no water, no nothing, and you work there as statisticians, teachers, agronomists, education for girls, all kind of stuff, but not once in a while to get yourself a credit for university, but as a lifestyle. Like you go and you live up there in High Atlas, serving the people that are yours. So this is what it was. It was going to the people movement, and there were thousands and thousands of Russians who went to the villages to serve in this capacity as agronomists and teachers and milkmaids and so forth. A small minority of those turned into terrorists. They decided, well, it's not good enough just to serve the people. We have to punish those that are guilty. And that means the czarist officials and the policemen and the czar himself. Now, the point is, of course, this particular czar wasn't guilty of anything. In fact, if anything, he was a reformer and a great reformer. But they didn't listen to this. They wanted to punish the Tsar as a symbol. And there was a terrorist group formed that decided to kill him. And it was like open season on the Tsar. They had all kinds of ideas how to kill the Tsar. It became an obsessive idea. And they tried several times. And several times it failed. One guy got a job in the Winter Palace and put a bomb there and it exploded, but Alexander wasn't there at the time. And another time the rail car exploded, but he wasn't there at the time. It was like really horrible. But on I think it was March 1 in 1880, he was going in his carriage along the riverside, and they threw the 3 bombs and they exploded. The first he survived and he walked out, and then they threw another one and it tore him to pieces. And today there's a really magnificent church in St. Petersburg on that place, very traditional. It looks like nothing else in St. Petersburg because it's very, very pre-Petrine, old traditional Russian church in the middle of a western city, which is called the Savior on the Blood, the church built on the spot where Alexander II was killed. In any case, I'll stop at that, but to finish with this kind of a summary. It was the era of the greatest reforms that made Russia into a modern European law-based country with a powerful military that showed itself in the Russo-Turkish War. On the other hand, it created a revolutionary movement in Russia, wasn't happy with the greatest reforms that could be. They still were not happy, and they wanted to punish the Tsarist authorities, and they hated the Tsar, and they were not happy with even when they killed this one. They will continue this terrorist activity and would create even more revolutionary parties that would actually undermine Tsar's authority and in the end lead to a Russian revolution. Thank you, and don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to APO Thinking.